In this video, we're going to do a quick review of some of the concepts from HTML that you'll need to know for this course. So we'll talk about the basic structure of HTML documents. We'll talk about some of the tags that can go into the head. We'll talk about some of the tags that can go in the body. And then finally, we'll do a quick overview of forms, but we'll talk more about forms later. So just to remember, HTML, short for Hypertext Markup Language, is used to define the structure of our web pages. And that's opposed to the other components. CSS is used for the styling. It's to change how the website looks or how it's laid out. And JavaScript is to provide interactivity. HTML is simply providing that structure, that foundation for the rest of your page. Okay, so let's talk about some of the anatomy of an HTML document. So you remember HTML5 documents need to start with that doc type tag. Okay, and then they're going to proceed with an HTML tag that's going to wrap the entire document. So you can see the start tag here at the beginning, the end tag at the end. Remember the end tags always start with slashes here, and the beginning tags do not have a slash. Okay, so we have our outer HTML tag, and we've got our head section, we can see there, we've got our body. Okay, so we'll look at what goes into those individual elements. More often than not, your head will have some meta tags, it will have a title, it will have some links, and might also have some scripts, but you kind of get the basic structure here. Your body, one note here, this is, again, remember how you write a comment in HTML. It's going to start with this less than, exclamation mark, dash dash, and it's going to end with dash dash, greater than. So the doc type tag, remember that always has to go at the beginning, and the whole reason for that is to prevent your browser going into what they call quirks mode, where it kind of behaves very oddly and tries to figure out, hey, are you HTML4, are you HTML5, and does some interesting things there. We want to avoid that, and we want it to behave per the HTML5 standards. So that's what that doc type does, is it tells the browser this is a valid HTML5 document and was written in the past decade, so please treat me sensibly. The next thing you'll see down there is the HTML tag. Again, that needs to wrap the entire document. Do note that you probably want to put the language attribute on that, language en, and that's good for telling the browser what kind of language that your page is written in. That's needed for search engines. It's also needed for your browser. If you don't put that, you're more than likely to run into a situation where your browser says, hey, this looks like it's in Italian. Do you want me to translate it? Or whatever other language it thinks it's in. So that does help the browser get some idea of what language you intended it to be and language your content is in. Okay. Next piece, the head. Remember, the head is for anything that's machine readable or metadata. That's where we put information about the document, but not the content of the document itself. So you'll see things in there like links to style sheets, links to scripts, any other metadata specifically for search engines and browsers and the like that they may need to render your page. Okay. One of the common tags that you'll see in the head is the meta tag. The meta tag comes in a lot of different forms. Typically, it's going to have a name attribute and a content attribute. So, for instance, you can see a few examples here. We've got name description. We've got content is such and such. In this case, this meta description would be for the search engine to kind of have a description of the page if it comes up in search results. Or this meta viewport, well, the viewport here is used to tell mobile devices how to render your website. So this particular viewport says, well, render the website as the width of your screen and 100% scale, which is usually what you want. A similar thing here. This one's kind of interesting, meta character set. You'll only ever have this once, and it should be really the first tag in your head. But it tells the browser or search engine or whoever's reading this what character set is this file in. Now for us, that should always be UTF-8. That's Unicode with basically 8-bit groupings. That'll be the case for as long as you're working with US files. If you're working for something from maybe a different country, it might be a different value here for the character set, but as long as you're working with US files, this is kind of the norm, is UTF-8. Okay. Next thing, it kind of goes in there. The title's also used by search engines. The title is what specifies if you're looking at the search engine, it's the top thing that appears in the search result. Description appears beneath that, but it's also the text that appears in your tab or your window, whatever version of browser you're using. Typically the tab name. Link can be used for a lot of different things. Generally used for referring to external resources or resources that, hey, this is not in this file, but you'll need this to go load the file. So the most common thing that you'll see there is links to style sheets. That's not the only thing that can appear, but that is the most common thing to appear. Okay, so in that case, you'll see things like this where it says relationship is style sheet. You might see a type is text CSS. That type nowadays is actually optional. You don't have to provide it, but you do have to provide the href, which says where is the file that you want to reference. So in this case, I'm saying go to the root, look in a folder named CSS, and look for main CSS. And that's typically where we'll store our CSS files, or core CSS file is in that root CSS directory. Okay, so we've talked about some of the tags that go into the head. Let's talk about some of the tags that can also go into the body now, which is where obviously most of our bread and butter is in the body. With HTML5, we got a bunch of new what we call semantic tags, and specifically the ones I want you to pay the most attention to is the ones that can be used for creating sections of your page. So namely header. If you've got a section up above the page that's kind of static and stays the same from page to page to page, typically that would go into a header. If there is a section that has navigation, so let's say you've got a nav bar up at the top, you might want to put that into a nav tag. In reality, sometimes that means that we have a header and a nav tag inside of it. It's pretty common. We usually have both of those up at the top. Now nav, that's not necessarily the only place that nav will appear. Nav can also appear in, say, your sidebars or other places, or the footer where you may have navigation. But anytime you have a kind of area where there's a group of links, whether it be in the header, the footer, or the sidebar, that should be in a nav tag for semantic reasons. The main content of your page is where we're gonna put that in main. There should only ever be one main tag for your entire page. If you have more than one main tag, then you're not writing valid HTML. The browser won't complain at you, but the whole point of main is that this is the main content of the page, and there shouldn't be two copies of that. A side can be helpful if you do have sidebars on your website. That's what they should go into, is an aside. You can have those asides to left, right, or both. That's completely up to you, but they should be in an aside tag if you have a sidebar. And then similar is footer, header. There's also footer tags. So anything that you have that is the footer of a page should go into there. Now, there are some other semantic tags that may come up that may be interesting to you, depending on what you're building. There's also the section tag. The section is just kind of a general, here is a part of the page, and that can go into a lot of these different things. More than often, the section tag is usually put into main, I'd say. Usually it's part of main, but it can actually be in a lot of these different places. Article, that's if you were writing a blog or a news website of any sort, you would use article to delimitate the articles or blog posts that are there. So those are other semantic tags that you may run into or you may need, depending on what you build. Okay. So talking about some more general tags, div tag is your general block level tag. It has no meaning, but it creates a vertical block in your page. So anytime you have a tag that needs no meaning, use the div tag. Don't use the p tag, by the way, for that purpose. The p tag has a specific meaning as a paragraph, which also means that it comes with some default styling, including bottom margin and top margin usually. Whereas your div, out of the box, has no styling, and that's good. Similarly, if you need an inline level element that has no styling, then you'd want to use the span. So your two generic block and inline level elements are going to be your div and your span. Those come with no CSS pre-applied. So what is a block level element and what is a inline level element? Well, a block, as the name kind of explains, it creates a block, right? It creates a section, and it's usually by default blocks, especially divs, are 100% width, but then their height is determined by the amount of content inside of them. Okay, so block level elements are things that we can assign width and height and padding and margin to. Really common block level elements that you'll see are divs. Remember H1, H2, etc. Those heading elements are also blocks. Paragraphs are blocks. Ordered lists, unordered lists, list items, all of these are considered block level items. And one of the things to remember there, with a block you kind of implicitly get a new line. Because let's say I write a series of 3 divs, well, they're going to appear vertically oriented. So if you do need to have content be vertically arranged, I would strongly suggest to you to use the div tag to get that arrangement, to use block level elements, not to use BRs. BRs traditionally have been used to make those breaks, to say, hey, here's the end of the line, I want to start a new line. But the BR tag has a lot of problems in it when it comes to responsive design. So in terms of building responsive websites, please don't use the BR tag. Use the div tag instead, because it achieves that same goal, but it allows you to build responsive websites instead of causing issues for you later. Next up, inline elements. Inline elements don't create a new line. So you can put a bunch of them in line, and they're usually used for things like styling text. Not per se, that is not their only purpose, but usually their purpose is to style text. So for instance, we've got the span that we just talked about. Span has no styling by itself, but you can wrap it around some text, apply some CSS to it, and now it's styled. Strong will generally bold the text. The EM tag stands short for emphasis. Typically, we'll put make that text italic. Both of these are completely configurable. But that's kind of the default. By default, strong is bold, and EM is italic. There's more kind of semantic meaning to those if you want to dig into the reason why those both exist and why they have those different stylings. That's maybe not a topic for today. Next up, another really common inline element you'll see is the anchor tag. Okay, the anchor tag. And that's the A. That's anytime we want to make a link, remember we use the A or anchor tag. And then finally, image. Well, image is kind of a weird one because, yes, it's actually an inline element by default, which is kind of contrary because we think about normally inline elements are things that kind of run along with text. Well, image technically runs along with the same line of text that you have. It usually doesn't do what you want when you mix images and text in the same kind of space. But technically it's considered an inline element. So you just need to remember to deal with that and remember to change the behavior of these elements between, say, inline or block. Remember, you can use the CSS display property to make that change. So do keep these ones in mind. You've got your span and you've got your blocks. One thing that you also want to remember with inlines cannot contain blocks. Any of your inline elements cannot contain a block per official CSS standards or official box model standards. So again, the browser will let you put blocks inside of inlines, but you tend to get all sorts of layout funkiness. So you're typically going to see blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks, and then finally at this lower level you have just inlines. You don't go back to blocks. So we're talking about headers a little bit. Remember the H1, there's the H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6 levels. Each of those give you a different size of heading. H1 is always going to be your biggest or highest level section. H6 is going to be your lowest level section. Make sure that when you're using those H1 tags, though, H1 or those heading tags, make sure you're using them for their semantic purpose, though. Search engines and the like, there's a lot of tools out there that use those levels to build outlines or other things from your website. So if you're saying, well, I'm going to use an H4 here, and then I'll use an H6 here and an H2 here, because I want the font to be that size, you're going to run a lot into some issues down the line. So rather than picking what level header you're going to pick, picking level of header based on the size of font you want to pick it based on where it's located in the text, right? So if you start out your overall section, generally your page is going to have one H1, and that should be up at the top. You generally don't want to have more than one H1 in a page. Technically, you are allowed to have more than one H1 as long as you put them in sections. So like this section can have an H1, this section have an H1, this section can have an H1, similar if you kind of think about it as articles, right? So maybe an article has H1, H2, and H3, and then this next article is H1, H2, H3. But other than that specific case, you're typically only going to have one H1. You'll have then your H2s beneath that, your H3s beneath that, etc. So don't skip levels. That does create problems, especially if you're trying to build an outline of the website. If you want to change the font size, and it's not really a heading, then just use CSS or to get the size you want. I'd really stress using the font size property. Paragraph tags, as we talked, as I kind of mentioned previously, represent a paragraph of text. They don't represent general block level elements. They are block level elements, but you shouldn't treat them as general. And part of that is that they come with top and bottom margin. That top and bottom margin is browser dependent, how much you have. If you're using Bootstrap will reset that to be a standard top and bottom margin, so it isn't from browser to browser. But recognize that even Bootstrap still recognizes that that makes sense. A paragraph of text should have space between them. So don't use the P element as a general blockable element. Another thing to know, similar how there's special rules with inline elements. A P tag per the HTML spec cannot contain other blocks. A P can only contain inlines. So if you try to put P's in there and use them as general containers, you go to try to validate your HTML, you're going to find that it doesn't validate because things like divs, etc., your blocks cannot be put inside of P's. Okay. Ordered lists. So ordered lists generally start with that are going to start with that OL tag and with the closing OL tag. For each item in the list, we'll use this LI tag. And remember, OL is rendered with typically numbers. You can change what the list styling is with CSS, but typically it's going to start with be 1, 2, 3, etc. 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So OL tags means anything that you have there's an order to those items in the list, or the order matters. They're not just randomly arranged. Next up we have is the UL tag, or the unordered list. And this one, more often than not, we tend to use a lot more ULs than OLs. We will use OLs or ordered lists if we're saying we'll do this step and then do this step and then do this step, if there's an order to things like that. But more than often, our lists don't usually have a necessarily defined or specific ordering. So usually we'll put in UL. And remember here, whether it's an ordered list or an unordered list, each item is bounded by an LI tag. So, and the UL usually is going to render with bullets instead of numbers, as we saw with the OL. Okay, so finally we want to go over a kind of quick abbreviated overview of HTML forms. We'll do this in a more expanded form tomorrow, after we've done a little bit of CSS, because there's a lot more to the world of forms than what I can fit in a few minutes. So let's get a quick introduction to what they look like, though. So talking about forms, generally you're going to have the form, you're going to have the opening tag, you're going to have the ending tag. Ending tag's required. There's two really, really important properties on a form. First up is going to be the action. The action tells the form where it needs to send its data to. Where is it going to post the form submission? And then the method tells it how it's going to send that. Data. So that method can generally be get, or it can be post. If it's get, then the data is all sent as part of this query string, as part of the URL. If it's sent via post, then you're going to be sending all your data in kind of the body, the request body, which means that it's not immediately visible in the URL. It's not terribly secure. It's still kind of out there. Anybody who's watching your internet traffic can still see both of these things if you're not encrypted, namely over HTTPS. If you're just using HTTP, these are just as visible. But there is some definite concern. There's definitely some security concerns that you might say, well, yeah, I probably still want to send things like passwords over as post and never as get and things like that. So as the semester moves along, we'll talk about more. We'll start building some of these forms, and we'll build the back end for the forms. So we'll talk more about, what does the action mean, and what does that, how do we use that method? Okay. So a few tags that you'll need to know that go along with forms. First up is going to be the input tag. The input is going to create a variety of different inputs that you can use to enter data, but a single input is just to enter a single piece of data. A select tag is going to give you a menu of options. There's a few actually different versions of select that you can get, but the most common one that you see with select is dropdowns. That's what you're going to see by default. Next up, you got text areas. So text areas gives you a way to have multi-line text for the user to enter. Now that is unformatted, that's plain text. It doesn't give you a way to do like, hey, I want these words to be bold or these words to be italic. You have to use a few more advanced techniques to get rich text editing. Next up, we've got buttons. So anytime you need a clickable or programmable button, whether it be just a general purpose button, a submit button, or a reset button, all those things will do with the button tag. There's also with HTML5, there is the new field set tag, and that will group a bunch of controls. So you can say this group of controls goes together. So you might think of, for instance, your address information. That might all go together, or your billing address, your shipping address, your credit card information. Those things you might bound with a field set to say these inputs go together. Along with the field set, we've also got the legend tag. The legend tag provides a caption for the field set. And the place you're going to put the legend is immediately inside the field set, but it needs to be the first child of the field set to work properly. Okay, so an example form with all of those tags together might look something like this. You're going to start with the form on the outside. So start the form and the form. In this case, we've only got one group, so there's one field set that begins here, ends there. Your average form is going to have definitely more than one field set. And usually oftentimes I'll put my buttons in a separate field set for grouping purposes. So the legend, here we've got simple form, so that's the caption that's going to appear for these group of controls. We can see next that we've got an input, right? So the name of the input is email. That name is very important because that's the key that will be used to send the value to the server. You can see the type is email, so that changing the type provides a little bit of validation, so it will do some validation to make sure there's like an @ sign and a dot and TLD or like com at the end, so we'll do some basic validation with it. It also means that on mobile devices, this field will show up with like the @ sign on the soft keyboard, which is nice. And then you finally have the placeholder on this input. Placeholder says, well, here's the hint that I want to give the user. So it'll be kind of text that's faded out. So email here. So we have an input for the email, and then we have a dropdown, which is the select. So it's got a name of favorite pet. It's got 4 options inside of it. So each of these are things that will appear in the dropdown. By default, what's selected with a dropdown is going to be the first item. So that's why we have this sort of invalid option at the beginning. It's a good practice to get into. So we say favorite pet, and the value is blank. So it's going to say favorite pet, but it's not going to have an assigned value, which means that if you try to submit it, it's going to say, hey, please pick something. Next up, we've got dog, we've got cat, we've got bird. You'll see the value that's between the text that's between the beginning and the end tag. That's what's going to show up in the dropdown. What's here in the value is what we're actually going to send to our backend, send to our server. So the user sees this, but we as developers, we're going to see that when we're on the back end. And finally, we have a submit button. It's a button tag. We can see the type of button is submit with the text submit. So that would look something like this. You've got the email input, you've got the drop down for your favorite pet, and then you've got a submit button. Okay. So what did we learn today? What did we cover in this video? Remember, we talked a bit about the overall structure of an HTML document. We talked about some of the tags that can go into the head. We talked about some of the tags that can go into the body, some of those content tags. And then we got a quick introduction to forms.